Okay, yes. Well, this is where I like to do this because you see, I'm coming at the other angle there. It's kind of surprising to someone like you. What am I getting from Gary? Well, for one thing, you've replied to this. You're like, where are you? Piro, I sort of understand you. And yet, what? And yet it puts up some good, interesting things. I mean, on the one hand, I maybe can explain inmendham's approach a little bit. Maybe not. That's yet to be determined. But also, I can explain to you some of these issues that I don't think should be differences between us. That in your rhetoric shows a difference. One is you're talking about this material component. Granted, everything is material. That's what materialism says. So everything is going to have a material component. At the very least, getting a feeling, a pleasure or displeasure, has this neurological, right? Some material thing is happening in your brain. But the idea of material is there to distinguish between things that are very material through things that are only a little bit material. Okay. There's a lot of ways. And does it sound arbitrary? Whatever. You can say how much mass is there, how much energy is there. There's more matter. Now, does it matter more in the things that you care about? No, it's not that same sense of matter, but it is related, right? Now, I define existence, I think, the only skeptical relativistic way you can. I exist. That's just the precept. But what's it mean? I don't know what it means. I'm investigating that. But it's a tautological definition. It's intended to be. I have named this phenomena of what's going on for me as existence. Okay. Survival is the continuation of that. Right? If I don't survive, that stops. So, I make judgments about, which things have more material components based on relativity ultimately to my survival, right? Now, I don't say that it makes suffering any more objective. I say both the pleasure and displeasure, including the level of suffering, are subjective. Okay, and I explain something else about suffering and the suffering of the very wealthy or whatever else. But first, okay, I'm not granting that is objective. What I'm saying is if you study the material components of a pleasure and a displeasure, suffering level of displeasure, when what we call suffering is probably specifically displeasure, where there is a material component. And, okay, not just that it exists, but I'm a relativist, that material component compares as more significant. So, for example, if you have a poison and it's going to kill thing A, or it's going to kill thing B, you can compare which has more material involved. And again, it could be as simplistic, if possible, in some very limited cases in physics. It's literally just that it has more energy in it, or more mass, that it's, there's more biomass. Thing A is a whole forest. Thing B, one tree. Okay, so yeah, one has a bigger material component. But again, because of logical consequence, material is also, things that have consequence. Okay, more or less to you. Okay, it bothers me if somebody is going around and breaking people's toes. And I'm worried about that, and that makes a material difference in how I have to run my day. But if they break my toe, that is more material to me because now I need medical attention. It might get infected or whatever. I can't compare these things. You can always compare. Now, is the comparison arbitrary? Yeah, why? Because the criteria you use to compare also is relative. And the criteria you use to judge which criteria to use, also relative. And that's why I say ultimately we have to find some principle. Now, at this point, you can choose different principles, but I don't see any principle that doesn't reduce down into some form of pragmatism in the sense that it's checked against the real world. It is checked against the real world. It could be, you should always go left. If that works for you, that's what your directions will always be. If it doesn't, then you'll figure out something more sophisticated or less sophisticated, and you'll try it against the real world. If you find one that really works well against the real world, doesn't mean you conceived of what how the real world really is. It means that you've made a model that is functionally equivalent to the part of the real world you're applying it to. Okay. So the material component to a bad color on your car, having a little stress, yeah, there's a medical component there. You are endangered, right? I'm using survival, right? And its corollary, health. You know, if you have no food, that matters more. You know, that's other, you know, way of thinking about material. You know, these things have consequences. Material consequences. I know, I said you could count up the mass, but really, ultimately, it all means what matters, what has a consequence. The term material in a material consequence. You know, if a whole forest dies, all sorts of animals die as a consequence. One tree dies, a few animals may die, and a few may be displaced. You can compare those two things. You don't need to have an all or nothing perspective, you know, on what reality is. Now, ultimately, I'm a subjectivist, but my materiality is 100% compatible with, fits with, how we consider the ideal materialist to think. But ultimately, when they stop and say, hey, it's a substance, I'm saying, well, really for us it's a concept. So it's a concept of a substance. I believe in the concept of a substance, but I believe it's just a concept. I believe that concept doesn't apply in all reference frames. Okay, but I still use the concept. In fact, I have a couple replacement concepts used in different reference frames, such as everything is energy, which is different than a substance, or that energy is a substance, and changing how I think of substance to reflect the kind of strange nature of pure energy. So that's how we're comparing, and what I'm granting to inmendham is a practical thing. Fact is, we have a lot of pleasures in America cause suffering in other worlds. I mean, in other parts of the world, other worlds. Freudian stuff? No, maybe. But that's just a fact of life. Plus, a lot of our pleasures and some of our cathartic things, it is, some people take competition this way. The pleasure comes from the fact that somebody else suffers a horrible defeat. We have that. We have that in our psychology. It's a good debate to go into just how zero-sum the game is. And not every quantity, if I make up a quantity slightly off bluish, that's not necessarily conserved in a zero-sum game. But other things like energy do seem to be. So which is pleasure and displeasure? Now, I'll finish by saying, which you know I believe, but the Epicureans believed that, it was a zero-sum game between pleasure and displeasure, but I don't remember them saying between my pleasure causing someone else's displeasure. And I think that I really probably haven't analyze the pleasure-displeasure balance problem quite that way, at least not since I was forced to study utilitarianism and was totally dissatisfied with the way they calculate sum total happiness. So a complex form, going back to that, I remember I was thinking, well, we really need a complex form of this. And that's an interesting topic and an important thing to think about. So that's the final moments of this video.